A magnificent Mustang stands frozen in terror, chained to the edge of a crumbling cliff face on Thunder Mountain. As storm clouds gather above his once proud spirit, now broken and abandoned, has given up hope until Michael Cooper discovers the horse. During a hike, what happens next will leave you breathless as one man's desperate mission to save a wild spirit becomes a journey of redemption that pushes him to his physical and emotional limits against a vengeful land developer, a violent storm, and the Mustang's own terror. The people of Horizon Ridge thought they knew everything about sacrifice until they witnessed what unfolded on that mountain. This heart-wrenching story of betrayal, second chances, and unexpected heroes will show you how. A Mustang named Tempest chained to a cliff with no hope of survival, and the veteran who refused to abandon him changed each other's lives forever in ways that left everyone who witnessed it in tears. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning Ian from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across Thunder Mountain, bending the pines and carrying the distant rumble of a storm. Michael Cooper paused in the narrow trail, his breath-forming clouds in the cool morning air. His weathered face turned toward the sound that had caught his attention. Not the wind, not the coming storm, but something else, a sound that didn't belong, a cry. Desperate, pained Michael's hand instinctively moved to his side where his service weapon had once rested, a habit from his military days that he couldn't shake even 3 years after coming home. His eyes sharp, despite the nightmares that rarely let him sleep, scanned the rugged terrain. "Hello," he called, his voice swallowed by the vastness of the mountain landscape. "Anyone there?" Only the wind answered, but then it came again, a sound that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Not human, but filled with a desperation that was all too familiar to Michael. The sound of something fighting for its life. He left the trail following the cry across loose shale and around a sharp bend that opened to a ledge overlooking a steep drop. That's when he saw it, and the sight froze him in place. A horse known, not just any horse, a Mustang, stood trapped on a narrow outcropping, 50 feet below the magnificent animal's coat. What should have been gleaming chestnut was matted with dirt and what looked like blood. Its powerful body trembled with exhaustion and fear. But what made Michael's blood run cold was the heavy chain wrapped around the Mustang's neck, and for legs, the other end bolted into the rock face. Someone had put it there. Someone had deliberately chained a wild horse to the side of the mountain and left it to die. "Jesus Christ," Michael whispered, dropping to his knees to get a better look. The ledge the horse stood on couldn't be more than 4 feet wide, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet below. One wrong move, one slip, and the Mustang would fall to its death, held in place only by the cruel chain that was already cutting into its flesh. The Mustang's eyes, wide with terror, found Michael's in that moment. Something passed between them, a recognition that shook Michael to his core. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the eyes of his fellow soldiers. He'd seen it in his own reflection. The look of something wild and proud brought to the edge of breaking. "Hold on," Michael said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm going to get you out of there." The horse tossed its head, pulling against the chain, each movement bringing it dangerously close to the cliff's edge. Michael assessed the situation with the calculated precision that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan. The narrow path down to the ledge was treacherous, made worse by the loose rock and strengthening wind. The storm on the horizon was moving in fast. He had maybe an hour before it hit. No time to go for help. By the time he made it back to town and convinced someone to come back with him, the storm would be raging and the Mustang would likely be dead. Michael pulled off his backpack and took inventory: rope, water, a first aid kit, his pocket knife, a small hatchet, not enough to break a heavy chain, but maybe enough to keep them both alive. As he prepared to make his descent, he pulled out his phone. No signal. Ace expected this high up. He scrolled to his daughter's picture anyway. Ellie smiled, giving him the courage he needed. He'd promised her he'd come back from this hike, that he wouldn't take any unnecessary risks after losing her mother. Ellie lived in constant fear of losing him too. "Sorry, kiddo," he murmured. "This one's necessary." The first drops of rain began to fall as Michael secured his rope and began his descent. The Mustang watched him, muscles tensed, ready to strike out. If this strange human proved to be another threat. "Easy," Michael called over the rising wind. "Easy, boy, I'm going to help you." The path down was even more treacherous than it had looked from above. Twice, Michael's foot slipped, sending cascades of small, rocks tumbling into the void below. Each time the Mustang flinched, pulling against its chains. When Michael finally reached Thelage, he moved slowly, keeping his voice low and steady the way he'd been taught in the cavalry unit where he'd served before. Being reassigned to combat. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, edging closer. "Those bastards who did this to you, I'm not like them." The Mustang's nostrils flared, taking in Michael's scent. Its coat was worse up close, not just dirty, but marked with welts and cuts that told a story of prolonged abuse. This wasn't a wild Mustang that had just been captured. Someone had been mistreating this animal for weeks, maybe months. The chain was heavy, duty industrial strength secured to an iron spike driven deep into the rock face. No way to break it with the tools he had. Michael would have to free the horse from the collar and leg restraints. "I'm going to have to touch you." Michael warned, taking a slow step forward. The Mustang's eyes rolled white with fear, and it lashed out with surprising strength, nearly sending Michael over the edge of the cliff. Only his quick reflexes saved him, his hand grabbing a rocky outcropping at the last second. "Whoa." Michael gasped, his heart pounding. "I get it. You don't trust humans. Can't say I blame you." Rain was falling steadily, now making the already precarious footing slick and dangerous. The wind had picked up too, howling around the mountain face like a living thing. The storm was coming in faster than Michael had anticipated. He tried again, approaching from a different angle, talking softly as he moved. "My name's Michael. I served with the Army's last mounted unit before they reassigned me to infantry. Spent more time with horses than people for a while. Their best years of my life." The Mustang's ears flicked forward, something in Michael's tone reaching past its terror. "My daughter Ellie, she loves horses, got a little pony named Daisy. Nothing like you, though. You're something special, aren't you? A real wild one." Another step closer. The Mustang trembled but didn't. "Strike out. Whoever did this to you, they're going to pay. I promise you." That Michael was close enough now to see that what he'd thought was a simple collar around the horse's neck was actually a complex arrangement of chains that wound around its powerful chest, and for legs there. Strains were secured with heavy padlocks and no way to pick them, and cutting through the chain would take tools he didn't have. "Damn it," Michael muttered, rain dripping from his face. Ash examined the restraints. The spikes in the rock were more promising. They'd been hammered and not cemented. With enough leverage, he might be able to work them loose. He took the hatchet from his pack and wedged it under the base of the nearest spike, using it as a lever. The spike didn't budge. A crash of thunder directly overhead made both man and horse jump. The storm was upon them. Now rain coming down in blinding sheets. Michael's hands were going numb with cold, his grip on the hatchet weakening. "Come on," he growled, throwing his weight against the tool. The Mustang winced in fear as lightning split, Thesky illuminating the sheer drop just feet away from where they stood. Michael repositioned, finding a better angle, and pushed again. This time he felt a slight give. Encouraged, he kept pressure on the hatchet, working it back and forth. The spike began to loosen the rock around it, crumbling. Another flash of lightning, another crash of thunder, and suddenly the ground beneath them shifted. A section of the ledge, weakened by the rain, gave way. The Mustang screamed in terror as its back hooves slipped over the edge, the chain now the only thing keeping it from plummeting into the abyss. No, Michael lunged forward, grabbing the chain with one hand and the horse's mane with the other, using all his strength to help the animal find its footing again. For a moment they teetered on the brink, man and horse connected by nothing but Michael's grip and sheer will. With a desperate surge of strength, the Mustang pulled itself back onto what remained of the ledge, trembling violently. Its eyes met Michael's again, and this time there was something new there. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. This human was trying to help. Michael didn't waste the moment. He turned to the spike, now more exposed after the rock slide, and put everything he had into one final push. With a grinding sound, the spike pulled free from the rock. Part of the chain was loose, but the Mustang was still secured by two more spikes. Michael moved to the next, one working with desperate speed as the storm raged around them. The ledge continued to crumble under their feet, each crash of thunder seeming to shake the very mountain. The second spike came free more easily than the first, leaving just one more. Michael's hands were bleeding, now torn by the sharp rock and metal, but he barely felt the pain. The ledge gave another ominous shudder beneath them. "Almost there," he told the Mustang, which was now watching him with an intensity that seemed almost human. "One more, and you're free." He'd just positioned the hatchet under the final spike when a new sound cut through the storm. A voice carried on the wind. "Cooper, step away from that horse." Michael looked up, squinting through the rain. A figure stood at the top of the cliff where Michael had begun his descent. Even through the storm, he recognized Thomas Blackwood, the wealthy developer who'd been buying up land around Horizon Ridge for his luxury resorts. "That animal is my property," Blackwood shouted. "You're trespassing and attempting to steal what's mine." Michael's shock quickly gave way to rage. "Your property, you did this? You chained a wild horse to a mountain to die?" "That beast killed my son." Blackwood's voice was nearly lost in a crash of thunder. "It deserves worse than this." The lead shifted again, more dramatically. This time Michael knew they had seconds, not minutes, before the whole section gave way. "Leave now, Cooper," Blackwood called, "or I'll have Sheriff Miller arrest you for trespassing and theft." Michael turned back to the Mustang, whose eyes hadn't left his face. "Sorry, pal," he said quietly. "I don't take orders from monsters." With one final desperate effort, Michael wrenched the last spike free from the rock. The chain fell away, leaving only the collar and leg restraints. But the Mustang was no longer tethered to the cliff. It was the wrong moment for victory. With a sickening lurch, the ledge finally gave way. Completely. Michael felt himself falling, the world spinning around him in a blur of rock and rain. The Mustang's scream mingled with his own as they plummeted toward the jagged rocks below. In that moment, suspended between life and death, Michael's mind filled with Ellie's face, the daughter he'd promised to come home to, the little girl who'd already lost. Too much. He'd failed her, just as he'd failed the men under his command in that dusty village halfway around the world. Then impossibly something solid slammed into him. The Mustang, somehow finding purchase on a narrow shelf of rock 20 ft below, had positioned itself beneath Michael. He landed hard on the animal's back, the impact driving the breath from his lungs. But he was alive. How? Michael gasped, clinging to the Mustang's mane as they balanced precariously on the small outcropping above them. Blackwood's face appeared at the edge of the cliff, contorted with rage. "This isn't over, Cooper," he shouted before disappearing back into the storm. Michael assessed their new situation. They were alive, but still in grave danger. The narrow shelf they'd landed on couldn't hold them for long, and the main trail was now even further away. But unlike the artificial ledge that had given way, this was solid rock, part of the mountain's natural formation. "Good instincts," Michael told the Mustang, patting its neck gently. The animal tensed but didn't pull away. "How about we make a deal? You get us out of here, and I'll make sure no one ever chains you up again." As if understanding, the Mustang turned its head toward a narrow, barely visible path that curved around the mountain face, a natural trail that only a sure-footed wild horse would recognize. "You lead, I'll follow," Michael said, sliding carefully from the horse's back to stand beside it. With the storm still raging and Blackwood's threat hanging in the air, man and horse began their treacherous journey together. A veteran who'd lost his purpose and a wild spirit who'd nearly lost its freedom, finding in each other the strength to survive, telling and preparing. This story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The narrow path clung to the mountainside, barely wide enough for the Mustang to place its hooves. Michael followed close behind, one hand lightly touching the horse's flank for balance. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, but the rocks remained treacherously slick steady. Michael murmured as loose stones skittered away beneath his boots, disappearing into the fog-shrouded drop below, one step at a time. The Mustang moved with a grace that belied its weakened condition, picking its way down the treacherous slope as if born to this free mountain. Every few minutes it would stop, turning to look at Michael with those intelligent eyes waiting for him to catch up. "Never thought I'd be following a horse's lead," Michael said with a grim smile, "but you know this mountain better than I do." After an hour of slow, careful descent, the path widened slightly and curved away from the cliff edge. The immediate danger of falling had passed, but Michael knew they weren't safe yet. Blackwood's threat echoed in his mind. The developer wasn't a man known for empty words. The Mustang suddenly tensed, ears pricked forward in alarm. Michael froze too, listening through the patter of raindrops on leaves. He heard its voices and the distinctive sound of ATVs, Blackwood's men. Michael whispered, "They're coming for you." The Mustang poured at the ground nervously, its breathing quick and shallow. Despite being freed from the chains tethering it to the mountain, the horse still wore the heavy collar and leg restraints that would make moving through dense Forest difficult and noisy. Michael made a quick decision this way. He said gently, guiding the horse off the path and into a thicket of pines. The undergrowth was dense enough to provide cover but sparse, enough to allow them passage. We need to get those restraints off you, and I need tools for that. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the growl of engines. Michael led the Mustang deeper into the forest, trying to put as much distance between them and their pursuers as possible, without leaving obvious tracks in the soft, rain-soaked earth. Cooper, a voice called through the trees unnervingly close. "We know you're out here with the horse Mr. Blackwood just wants." "What's his?" Michael recognized the voice. Marcus Wilson, the mayor's son who worked for Blackwood, the young man had always struck Michael as someone who'd do anything for a paycheck. No matter how morally questionable that horse injured Jason Blackwood, Marcus continued, "It needs to be put down. You're only making this worse for yourself." The Mustang trembled at the human voices, muscles bunching as if preparing to bolt. Michael placed a steadying hand on its neck. "Don't believe them," he whispered. "We'll figure this out." The ATVs roared closer, forcing Michael and the Mustang to move faster through the trees. The restraints rattled with each step, threatening to give away their position. Michael's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. They couldn't outrun the vehicles. Not with the horse still partially chained. They needed somewhere to hide, somewhere tour group. As they crested a small rise, Michael spotted a narrow ravine cutting through the forest ahead. A creek swollen by the rain rushed along its bottom. It wasn't ideal, but water would mask their scent and might confuse their trail. "Come on," Michael urged. Leading the Mustang toward the ravine, the descent was steep, and the horse bulked at the edge. I know," Michael soothed. "But we don't have a choice." With gentle persistence, he coaxed the Mustang down the slippery bank and into the shallow water. The cold creek reached halfway up Michael's calves, numbing his feet almost instantly. The Mustang flinched as it stepped into the current but followed Michael's lead. They moved downstream, keeping to the water. The sound of the pursuers gradually fading behind them, the ravine twisted through the forest, taking them deeper into wilderness that even Michael, who'd lived in Horizon Ridge his entire life except for his military service, didn't recognize. After nearly a mile of wading through the increasingly deeper creek, Michael spotted what he'd been hoping for. A small cave set into Theravine wall, partially hidden by a curtain of hanging moss and ferns. It wasn't deep, more of an overhang really, but it would provide shelter and a place to rest in here, he said, guiding the Mustang toward the opening. The horse hesitated, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar scent of the cave. "It's all right, just for a little while." Inside, the cave floor rose above the water level, providing dry ground. It was larger than it had appeared, from outside extending about 15 ft into the ravine wall. Not spacious, but enough room for both of them to rest. Michael sank down on a flat rock, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming him. The adrenaline that had kept him going was wearing off, leaving him acutely aware of his injuries: scraped hands, bruised ribs from the fall, and a deep cut on his forearm that was still seeping blood. The Mustang stood near the cave entrance, alert and wary, but making no attempt to flee. Michael watched the magnificent animal in the dim light. Despite its ordeal, there was a dignity in the way it held itself, a wildness the chains couldn't diminish. "Who are you?" Michael wondered aloud. "And what did you do to make Blackwood hate you so much?" The horse turned at the sound of his voice, regarding him with that unnerving intelligence. In the better light, Michael could see the animal was a stallion, probably around 7 years old. His coat, where it wasn't matted with dirt and blood, was a rich chestnut with a distinctive white blaze down his face. A true Mustang with the compact, powerful build that came from generations of natural selection in the wild. "You need a name." Michael decided. "I can't keep calling you horse or Mustang. How about Tempest? Fits the storm we met." In the stallion's ears flicked forward at the name, as if considering it. "Tempest it is." Then Michael turned his attention to the painful task of examining his own injuries. The cut on his arm needed cleaning at the very least, possibly stitches. He opened his small first aid kit, grateful that it had survived the fall: antiseptic wipes, gauze tape, and a few basic medications. Not much, but better than nothing. As he cleaned the cut, gritting his teeth against the sting, his thoughts turned to his daughter Ellie. Would be getting home from school soon when he didn't return from his hike. She'd worry at 10 years old. She already carried too much anxiety about his safety, a burden no child should bear. I need to get back, he told Tempest, wrapping gauze around his arm, and I need to get those restraints off you. The chains around the stallion's neck and legs were secured with heavy padlocks. Without bolt cutters or a saw, Michael had no way to remove them here in the wilderness. He'd need to get Tempest to his ranch where he had the necessary tools, but first Michael continued. We need to figure out what's going on. Why would Blackwood chain a wild Mustang to a cliff to die even for him? That's extreme. Michael had never had much dealing with Thomas Blackwood. The wealthy developer had moved to Horizon Ridge 5 years ago, buying up properties and land for his luxury resort project. He'd brought money to the struggling new town, which had made him popular with the local government and business owners, but Michael had always found something unsettling about the man's cold efficiency. What was it Marcus had shouted that the horse had injured Blackwood's son? Jason Blackwood was in his early 20s, a privileged young man who developed a reputation around town for reckless behavior and treating locals with contempt. Did you hurt Hisson? Michael asked Tempest. Was it an accident? The stallion had moved closer. While Michael tended his wounds, now he reached out carefully and allowed the horse to sniff his hand. Those eyes studied him as if weighing his trustworthiness. I'm not saying you did anything wrong, Michael continued softly. I'm just trying to understand. Tempest nickered softly. Then, to Michael's surprise, the stallion lowered himself to the cave floor, folding his legs beneath him with the peculiar grace of horses. He was close enough that Michael could have reached out and touched him, though he didn't try. Tired. Hummy too. The sound of the rain outside and the rushing creek created a peaceful backdrop that belied their situation. Michael knew they couldn't stay in the cave indefinitely. Blackwood's men would keep searching, and Tempest needed proper medical attention for his wounds. The restraints were already causing inflammation where they rubbed against his skin. Michael's ranch. Whispering Pines lay about 5 miles east of their current position as best he could reckon. If they waited until nightfall, they might be able to travel there with less risk of being spotted. But that would mean Ellie would be alone and worried for hours. He pulled out his phone again. Still no signal as expected in this remote ravine, but the device had survived the ordeal, and the photo of Ellie's smiling face on his lock screen strengthened his resolve. We'll rest for an hour, he told Tempest then. We move, I've got a daughter waiting for me, and you need those chains off. The stallion's eyes were already closing. Exhaustion. Finally overcoming weariness, Michael leaned back against the cave wall, intending to stay alert while the horse rested, but his own fatigue betrayed him within minutes. His eyes grew heavy and he drifted into an uneasy sleep. Dreams came quickly, not the usual nightmares of gunfire and explosions, but chaotic images of falling of chains, of Blackwood's face twisted in rage, and through it all, Ellie calling for him, needing him. Michael jolted awake. Disoriented, the light in the cave had changed. How long had he been asleep? He checked his watch. Nearly 2 hours had passed outside. The rain had stopped, and golden late afternoon light filtered through the trees. Tempest was already awake, standing at the cave entrance, his posture alert. Michael rose stiffly, his body protesting every movement. The short rest had allowed his muscles to tighten and his injuries to stiffen. Time to go, he said. Joining the stallion at the entrance, he peered cautiously outside. The forest was quiet except for the natural sounds of birds and the rushing creek. No voices, no engines. It seemed their pursuers had moved on. At least for now, the path to my ranch isn't easy. Michael told Tempest, we'll have to cross the main road at some point, which is risky, but once we're there, I can get those restraints off you and tend to your wounds properly. The stallion tossed his head, a gesture that seemed almost like agreement. They left the shelter of the cave, continuing downstream for another half-mile before Michael led them up Theravine Bank and back into the forest. He oriented himself using the position of the setting sun, adjusting their course. Toward Whispering Pines, the going was slower than Michael had hoped. Tempest moved carefully, the leg restraints limiting his natural stride. The chain connecting his forelegs had enough slack to allow walking, but would prevent anything faster than a trot. Any attempt at a gallop would likely result in a dangerous fall as twilight settled over the forest. Michael began to recognize landmarks. A distinctive lightning-struck oak, a peculiar rock formation shaped like a bear's head. They were getting close to the edge of his property almost. There he encouraged Tempest, who was showing signs of fatigue. His head hanging lower with each step, the main road appeared ahead, a strip of asphalt cutting through the forest. Michael halted at the tree and watching. For vehicles, this county road wasn't heavily traveled, especially in the evening. But it would only take one person loyal to Blackwood to spot them and report their location. After several minutes with no cars passing, Michael judged it safe to cross quick. Now he urged Tempest, and together they hurried across the exposed road and into the trees on the other side. They were on Cooperland. Now the familiar territory lifting Michael's spirits despite his exhaustion. Just another mile to the ranch house and the barn where he could finally free Tempest from the cruel restraints. The sound of a vehicle approaching sent them deeper into the cover of trees. Michael held his breath as headlights swept the road. They just crossed the sheriff's patrol car, drove slowly past spotlights scanning the roadside. Dave Miller had been friends with Michael's father, but since taking campaign contributions from Blackwood, the sheriff's loyalties had become questionable. When the patrol car finally moved on, Michael led Tempest through a meadow that opened onto the back acres of Whispering Pines Ranch. The modest farmhouse was visible now, a light burning in the kitchen window. Michael's throat tightened at the sight. Ellie was home waiting. Then a movement near. The barn caught his eye. A flashlight beam swept across the yard. Someone was there searching his property. Michael pulled Tempest back into the shadow of the trees. "Change of plans," he whispered. "We can't go to the house yet." He led the stallion along the perimeter of his property toward the old hunting cabin that stood near the eastern boundary. His grandfather had built it decades ago, and Michael had maintained it as a quiet retreat. When the memories in the main house became too painful, it had basic supplies, tools, and most importantly, it was off the usual patrol routes that Blackwood's men or the sheriff might take. The small cabin appeared through the trees, its weathered logs silvery in the fading light. Michael approached, cautiously alert for any sign that someone had been there recently, but the cabin looked undisturbed. Inside, he quickly found what he needed: an old pair of bolt cutters in the tool chest. Tempest stood patiently in the small clearing outside as Michael set to work on the chains, starting with the cruel restraints on his legs. "This is going to feel better," Michael promised as the first lock broke under the pressure of the bolt cutters. The relief was immediate. Tempest lifted his freed leg, stretching it as if testing that it was truly released. The collar was more difficult, the lock stronger, and positioned in a way that made it hard to get leverage. Tempest stood statue still, seeming to understand the importance of not moving. While Michael worked, when the final restraint fell away, the stallion shook his entire body, as if shedding the memory of captivity along with the physical chains. "There," Michael said, stepping back to give the horse space. "You're free now." Tempest took a few experimental steps, his natural grace returning as he adjusted to movement without restraints. He circled the clearing once, twice, his pace increasing with each circuit. Michael watched, expecting the stallion to bolt into the forest at any moment, to return to whatever wild herd he'd been taken from. Instead, Tempest came back to where Michael stood, lowering his head to gently butt against the man's chest. "You're welcome," Michael said softly, cautiously, raising a hand to stroke the horse's neck. "But you should go now while you can. It's not safe here for you." Tempest didn't move, his eyes fixed on Michael's face with that unnerving intelligence. The sound of a vehicle approaching on the main road broke the moment. Headlights swept through the trees, slowing as they neared the turnoff to the ranch house. "That's probably Sheriff Miller," Michael said. "I need to get back to Ellie, let her know I'm all right, but you," he gestured toward the dense forest beyond the cabin, "you should go." Tempest tossed his head, backing up a few steps, but he didn't flee. Michael gathered the broken chains, stuffing them into an old feed sack he found in the cabin, evidence of Blackwood's cruelty that might be needed later. He tucked the bolt cutters under his arm and took one last look at the magnificent stallion standing in the clearing, finally free of his restraints. "Maybe I'll see you again sometime," Michael said, turning toward the path that would lead him home. As he walked away, he heard the soft sound of hooves on forest floor, not retreating into the wilderness but following behind him. Michael looked back to see Tempest trailing a few yards behind like a shadow in the gathering darkness. "You can't come home with me," Michael tried to explain. "It's too dangerous. Blackwood's looking for you, the sheriff too, probably." The stallion simply continued to follow, maintaining the same careful distance. Michael sighed, too tired to argue with a horse. "Fine, but stay in the trees until I can figure out what's going on together." They made their way toward the lights of the farmhouse. Man and horse moving like specters through the deepening twilight, neither fully understanding the bond that had begun to form between them, but both somehow aware that their lives had become irrevocably linked by the events on Thunder Mountain and waiting in the farmhouse ahead. A little girl who had spent the day fearful that her father wasn't coming home, a fear she knew all too well since her mother had left and never returned. The farmhouse lights cast long shadows across the yard as Michael approached. A sheriff's department SUV was parked in the driveway beside Ellie's small blue bicycle, with a gesture for Tempest to stay back in the tree. Michael squared his shoulders and prepared to face whatever waited inside before he reached the porch. The front door flew open. Ellie stood there, her small face pale with worry. Dark hair, falling from a messy ponytail at the sight of her father, her expression transformed relief, joy, then anger in quick succession. "Dad," she cried, launching herself off the porch and into his arms. Michael dropped the sack of chains and bolt cutters, catching his daughter and holding her tight, ignoring the pain that shot through his bruised ribs. "I'm sorry, kiddo," he murmured into her hair. "I'm so sorry I worried you." Over Ellie's shoulder, he saw Sheriff Dave Miller appear in the doorway, his weathered face unreadable in the porch light. "Cooper," the sheriff acknowledged, with a nod. "Your daughter was worried. Sick, called my office when you didn't come home on time." Michael set Ellie down gently but kept one arm around her shoulders, lost track of time. He said, meeting Miller's gaze steadily, "Storm caught me on the mountain." Miller's eyes narrowed, taking in Michael's bedraggled appearance. The dirt and blood on his clothing, the bandage visible on his arm. "Looks like more than just a storm found you up there, Dad. You're hurt." Ellie had noticed the bandage too, her eyes widening with concern. "It's nothing, just a scratch," Michael assured her, though Heck knew it was a poor lie. The cut would likely need stitches, and every muscle in his body screamed with fatigue. "Let's get you inside," Ellie said, taking charge in a way that reminded Michael painfully of her mother. Rebecca had been the same way, commanding in moments of crisis, practical when others might panic. As they turned toward the house, a soft nickering sound came from the darkness beyond the yard. Ellie froze, her head snapping toward the sound. "What was that?" she asked Michael, hesitated, caught between truth and protection. "Probably just a deer, Sheriff." Miller was already reaching for his flashlight, pointing it toward the trees. "Didn't sound like any deer I know." Before Michael could stop her, Ellie had pulled away from him and was moving toward the tree. "Hello," she called softly. "Ellie, wait." Michael started, but it was too late. Tempest stepped out of the shadows into the edge of the yard, his presence commanding, despite his weakened state. In the combined glow of the porch light and Miller's flashlight, the stallion's injuries were starkly visible. The raw marks from the chains, the cuts and bruises that marred his powerful body. "Oh my God," Ellie whispered, stopping in her tracks. "Dad, he's hurt." Sheriff Miller's hand moved to his holster, a reflexive action that made Michael step quickly between him and the horse. "Easy, Dave." Michael said, "He's not dangerous. That's one of the wild Mustangs from Eagle Valley." Miller said, his voice tight. "The ones Blackwood's been complaining about. What's it doing here?" "I found him," Michael answered simply. "Up on Thunder Mountain. He was injured. I couldn't leave him." Ellie had already moved closer to Tempest, her natural affinity for horses overcoming any fear. The Mustang watched her approach with caution but didn't retreat. "Hey there," she said softly. "It's okay, we want to help you." To Michael's amazement, Tempest lowered his head, allowing Ellie to gently touch his nose. Something in the tension of the stallion's body eased to the contact, as if recognizing another gentle soul. "His name is Tempest," Michael told his daughter. "He's beautiful," Ellie breathed. "But who hurt him, Dad?" The question hung in the air, demanding an answer that Michael wasn't sure he should give in front of Sheriff Miller. The law enforcement officer had been a family friend, once had worked alongside Michael's father on the county force before becoming sheriff, but Horizon Ridge was a small town with a struggling economy, and Blackwood's money spoke louder than old loyalties these days. "That's what I'd like to know," too, Miller said, his gaze sharp on Michael's face. "Blackwood called in earlier today, says you stole a horse that belongs to him. Says his men saw you up on Thunder Mountain. Is that what he told you?" Michael couldn't keep the edge from his voice. "Did he also mention that he had this horse chained to a cliff face and left to die?" Miller's expression flickered. Surprise, then doubt. "That's a serious accusation." "Cooper," It's the truth. Michael gestured to the sack. He dropped the chains and restraints. Are right there custom-made heavy-duty? Ask Blackwood where he got them. Ellie had gone very still, her hand still resting on Tempest's muzzle. Someone chained him to a cliff. Her voice was small but filled with the righteous outrage only a child could fully express. Why would anyone do that? Blackwood claims this horse attacked his son. Miller says Jason was out riding near Eagle Valley last month when a herd of wild Mustangs charged him. Horse threw him, trampled him. Boy's still in physical therapy. Michael looked at Tempest, trying to reconcile the gentle creature who had saved his life, who now stood allowing a 10-year-old girl toe-stroke his face with a vicious attacker. It didn't fit, and Blackwood sure it was. This specific horse, Michael asked. Miller shifted uncomfortably, says the stallion has a distinctive white blaze that Jason pointed him out from photos of the local herds, so he tracked down a wild Mustang, captured it, tortured it, and left it to die as revenge for an accident. Michael's voice rose with each word. And you're okay with that, Dave? I didn't say that, Miller replied, defensive now. I'm just telling you what was reported. Ellie looked up at her father. Her young face troubled. Dad, we need to help him. He's really hurt. Michael ran a hand through his hair, weighing their options by the letter of the law. He had no right to. The horse-wild Mustangs fell under Bureau of Land Management jurisdiction, and if Blackwood had somehow obtained permits, which with his money and connections wasn't implausible, he might have legal claim to Tempest, but no legal claim could justify what had been done to the stallion. In need to get him medical attention, Michael said finally. There's a vet in town. Sarah Reynolds won't help. Miller interrupted. Blackwood's got half the town convinced these Mustangs are dangerous pests destroying grazing land, and the yeesh other half is too afraid of losing his business to speak up. Then what do you suggest? Michael challenged that. I hand him back to Blackwood so he can finish what he started. Miller wassilent for a long moment, his flashlight beam still illuminating. Tempest's injuries. Finally, he sighed and holstered his weapon. I didn't see any horse, he said quietly. Came out to check on a missing hiker, found him home safe. End of report. Relief washed through Michael. Thanks, Dave. The sheriff turned to Gotham, paused. Be careful. Cooper Blackwood isn't a man who forgets a slight, and technically you're harboring a wild animal without proper authorization. Heist's expression softened as he looked at Ellie. Your dad did a brave thing today, kid, but brave doesn't always mean smart. After Miller drove away, Michael and Ellie led Tempest to the small barn behind the house. The structure was old but sound, housing Ellie's pony Daisy and the two aging draft horses Michael occasionally used for pulling logs on the property. Daisy whinnied a greeting from her stall as they entered, her curiosity piqued by the newcomer, the draft horses. Thunder and Lightning were more reserved, watching the wild stallion with cautious interest. He needs water and food, Ellie said, already filling a bucket from the tap, and medicine for those cuts. Michael opened the empty stall at the end of the row, spreading fresh straw for bedding. I'm not sure he'll want to go in there, Ellie. His wild used to open spaces, but Tempest surprised him again. After drinking deeply from the bucket, Ellie offered. The stallion walked directly to the open stall and entered without hesitation, as if understanding that here at least was safety. While Ellie mixed a warm bran mash with molasses, a treat she insisted would help Tempest regain strength. Michael examined the horse's wounds more thoroughly in the barn's better light. The injuries were worse than he'd initially thought. The chain restraints had cut deep in places, especially around the neck and pasterns, and several wounds showed signs of infection. He needs antibiotics, Michael said grimly. And proper wound cleaning. Some of these are going to need stitches. What about Dr. Reynolds? Ellie asked, bringing the feed bucket. Sheriff Miller said she wouldn't help, but she loves horses. She always brings treats for Daisy when she comes. Michael considered this. Sarah Reynolds was one of the few people in town he genuinely trusted. She'd been a friend of Rebecca's, had helped Ellie cope after her mother's death with kind words and the gift of the pony, but her veterinary practice depended on local business and crossing. Blackwood could be professional suicide. It's worth a try. He decided. I'll call her in the morning for tonight. We'll do what we can with what we have. They worked together, father and daughter, cleaning Tempest's wounds with warm water and antiseptic from the first aid kit the stallion allowed. Their ministrations with surprising patience, flinching occasionally but never showing aggression. He trusts you, Ellie observed as Michael carefully cleaned a particularly nasty cut on Tempest's flank. I think he knows we're trying to help. How did you find him? Really? Michael hesitated, weighing what to tell. His daughter Ellie had already lost her mother. She lived with the constant fear that her father might disappear too. The truth of his dangerous cliff rescue would only frighten her more. But Ellie had always been perceptive, able to sense. When adults weren't being fully honest, it was a trait that had developed after her mother's death, a protective mechanism born of grief and uncertainty. I was hiking on Thunder Mountain, Michael began carefully. I heard a sound. Tempest calling for help. He was chained to a cliff ledge, left there to die. He omitted the details of the precarious rescue, the fall. The moment when he thought they were both finished, I managed to free him, and we made our way back here together. Ellie's eyes were wide, taking in the story and its implications. But why would Mr. Blackwood do something so awful? He claims Tempest hurt his son during a riding accident. But even if that's true, it doesn't justify what he did. It wasn't Tempest's fault, Ellie declared with absolute certainty. He's good, I can tell. Michael smiled despite his exhaustion. His daughter had always possessed an uncanny sense about animals, especially horses. Rebecca used to joke that Ellie could speak their language better than she could speak her own by the time they finished. Treating Tempest wounds, it was nearly midnight. The stallion stood quietly in the stall, his magnificent head lowered in exhaustion. Ellie yawned widely but refused to leave. The barn. He might get scared if we both go, she insisted. It's his first night in a stall ever. You can't sleep in the barn. Ellie, just for a little while, she pleaded. I'll sit with him until he falls asleep. Michael knew he should refuse, that he should insist on proper bedtime rules, normal routines, but the day had been anything but normal, and the bond forming between his daughter and the Mustang was something he was reluctant to disrupt. Half an hour. He conceded, then bed, school tomorrow, remember? While Ellie settled on a hay bale outside Tempest's stall, quietly reading aloud from the book she'd brought with her. Something about a girl and a wild horse. Appropriately enough, Michael stepped outside the barn to make a phone call. Dip night air had turned cold stars brilliant in the clear post-storm sky. Michael punched in a number he rarely used but had never forgotten. Waiting as it rang halfway across the country, Cooper, the voice that answered, was gruff with sleep but alert. It's the middle of the night. What's wrong? Sorry to wake you. Frank, Michael said. I need advice and maybe help. Frank Thompson had served with Michael in the cavalry unit, had been there during the ambush that had left half their team dead and Michael with both physical and psychological scars. After discharge, Frank had established a program in Kentucky, using horses to help veterans with PTSD. He was one of the few people who understood the darker places in Michael's mind, the triggers that could send him spiraling. Talk to me, Frank said, fully awake now. Michael outlined the situation. Tempest Blackwood, the precarious legal and ethical position he now found himself in. You always did have a talent for finding trouble, Frank remarked when Michael finished. But this is different. This matters. I can't give the horse back to Blackwood. You should see what he did to him, Frank. It reminds you of what they did to us in that village. I get it. Michael swallowed hard. Frank was right. The sight of Tempest chained and tortured had triggered something deep and raw, connecting to memories he'd spent years trying to suppress. What do I do? Legally, you're in murky water. Wild horses are protected, but management practices can be brutal, especially when private landowners are involved. Blackwood could claim he was removing a nuisance animal by chaining it to a cliff. I'm not saying he's right, I'm saying he's rich and connected. That counts for a lot in small towns. Michael sighed, watching his breath form clouds in the cold air. So, I'm on my own. I didn't say that either. Frank paused and Michael could hear the rustle of movement, as if his friend was sitting up, getting serious. Give me 2 days. I can be there with some resources, people who can help document the horse's condition, maybe get some media attention. Blackwood won't want publicity around his methods. 2 days might be too long. He's already sent men looking for Tempest. Tempest, huh? Frank chuckled. Already named him. You're in deep, brother, despite everything. Michael smiled. Yes, I am. Keep him hidden for now. Document his injuries, photos, video, whatever you can, and call that vet friend of yours. Even if she can't help directly, she might know someone who can. After ending the call, Michael returned to the barn. The sight that greeted him stopped him in the doorway, a lump forming in his throat. Ellie had fallen asleep against the stall door, her book fallen open in her lap. Inside the stall, Tempest stood with his head lowered, his muzzle just inches from Ellie's sleeping face as if standing guard over her. The wild stallion, who had every reason to fear and hate humans, was watching over a child he'd just met with protective gentleness. "Hey," Michael said softly, approaching slowly. "She's out cold." Tempest ears flicked toward Michael's voice, but the stallion didn't move away from Ellie. There was something in his posture, a quiet vigilance that reminded Michael of the military service. Dogs he'd worked with, creatures trained to protect at all costs. "You're something special, aren't you?" Michael murmured carefully, lifting Ellie into his arms. She stirred but didn't wake her head, nestling against his shoulder as it had when she was younger. Tempest watched them, his intelligent eyes following as Michael carried Ellie toward the barn door. "We'll be back in the morning," Michael promised. "Try to rest." Outside, the night had grown colder, the stars sharp and brilliant in the clear sky. As Michael carried his daughter back to the house, he felt the weight of the day's events settling on his shoulders. He had acted on instinct, on moral certainty. But now the complications were mounting. Blackwood wouldn't stop looking for Tempest. The law was at best a gray area, and Michael had put himself and potentially Ellie in the middle of a dangerous situation. Yet, looking down at this sleeping daughter's face, peaceful in a way it rarely was since her mother's death, Michael couldn't bring himself to regret his actions. Something about Tempest had already begun to heal a wound in Ellie, reaching a part of her that had been closed off in grief inside the farmhouse. Michael settled Ellie in her bed, pulling the colorful quilt Rebecca had made over her shoulders. The walls of her room were covered with horse posters and ribbons from the few riding lessons they could afford. Her dreams had always centered around horses, dreams that Michael had struggled to fulfill, on a veteran's disability pension and the modest income. From the small ranch back in his own room, Michael finally allowed himself to fully feel the exhaustion and pain of the day's ordeal. His body ached from the fall, from the miles of difficult terrain. They'd covered the cut on his arm, throbbed a reminder that he should probably seek medical attention himself. But as he drifted toward sleep, it wasn't his own injuries that concerned him. It was the look in Tempest's eyes when the stallion had first seen Ellie, recognition perhaps of another soul who had suffered loss. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe some animals, like some people, could sense kindness and respond to it even after experiencing tremendous cruelty. Morning came too quickly, pale sunlight streaming through the window to wake Michael from a sleep. Thankfully free of nightmares, for a moment he lay still, cataloging the pains in his body, remembering the events of the previous day. Then he heard Ellie's voice from outside, and he sat up quickly, wincing at the protest from his bruised ribs. Looking out the window, he saw his daughter in the yard, talking to a woman with red hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail. Era Reynolds, the veterinarian's truck, was parked beside the barn, out of sight. From the main road, Ellie must have called her first thing in the morning. Michael dressed hurriedly and made his way outside, where Sarah was retrieving a medical kit from her truck. "Morning, Michael," she said, her expression a mixture of concern and professional assessment as she took in his injuries. "Your daughter called, said you had a medical emergency. Sarah, I'm sorry to drag you into this." "She told me," Sarah interrupted, her voice low, "about the Mustang, about Blackwood. Is it true what he did?" Michael nodded. "I saw it with my own eyes. He had Tempest chained to a cliff face on Thunder Mountain, left to die." Sarah's face hardened. "Show me in the barn." Tempest stood alert in his stall, his posture tense at the sight of a stranger. Ellie was already beside him, her small hand on his neck, murmuring reassurances. "It's okay," she was telling the stallion. "Dr. Reynolds helps horses. She's going to make you feel better." Sarah approached slowly, her experience eye taking in the stallion's injuries. "My God," she breathed, "these wounds, some are days. Old Michael, he's been abused systematically, not just chained. Recently. Can you help him?" Ellie asked, her voice small. Sarah knelt to open her medical kit. "I'll do what I can, but Michael, you need to understand, I'm taking a huge risk being here. Blackwood has a lot of influence in town. I know if you want to leave." "I didn't say that," Sarah interrupted, pulling on surgical gloves. "I said it's a risk, one I'm willing to take. What Blackwood did is not just morally wrong. It's illegal animal cruelty at the very least. Sheriff Miller knows." Michael said he saw Tempest last night. Sarah raised an eyebrow and he walked away officially. "He never saw a horse. That's not going to hold if Blackwood presses the issue." Sarah approached Tempest carefully, speaking in soft, soothing tones. To Michael's relief, the stallion allowed her to examine him, though he remained watchful, He'll need antibiotics, wound care, proper nutrition. He's dehydrated and underweight too, we can take care of him," Ellie declared with the absolute certainty of a child. Sarah smiled at her. "I know you can, sweetheart, but there are legal complications. Wild horses are protected under federal law. Technically, your dad could be fined for having him here without proper authorization. But Mr. Blackwood was hurting him. I know, and that's wrong. But fighting someone like Thomas Blackwood requires more than being right, it requires proof documentation." Legal standing. Michael explained his conversation with Frank, the plan to document Tempest's condition and potentially bring media attention to the situation. Sarah nodded thoughtfully as she cleaned one of the deeper wounds on Tempest's neck. "That's a start, but Blackwood won't back down easily. He's been on a crusade against the wild Mustang since Jason's accident." "Was it really Tempest who hurt his son?" Michael asked. Sarah's hands paused in their work. "I treated Jason after the accident. He had a broken arm, concussion, some nasty bruises, but his story never quite added up. He claimed he was just riding peacefully when a herd of Mustangs attacked him out of nowhere. That doesn't sound like normal Mustang behavior," Michael said, thinking of the protective gentleness Tempest had shown toward Ellie. "It's not. Wild horses generally avoid humans unless provoked. There were rumors that Jason and some friends had been chasing the herd on ATVs for fun, harassing them. I suspect his horse spooked and threw him when the Mustangs finally turned to defend themselves. So Blackwood is punishing an entire herd for his son's stupidity." Sarah nodded grimly. "He's been pushing for the BLM to round up the Eagle Valley herd for months, claiming they're dangerous. So far, they've refused. The herd is protected under conservation efforts, but with enough pressure and money, he'll get his way." Michael finished. Ellie, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. "We can't let him hurt the other horse's dad. We have to stop him." There was a determination in his daughter's voice that Michael hadn't heard since before. Rebecca's death, the quiet, withdrawn child of recent years, had been replaced, at least momentarily, by the passionate, strong-willed girl she'd once been. Sarah finished treating Tempest's wounds, administering antibiotics, and leaving additional medication. "With Michael, I'll come back tomorrow to check on him," she said as she packed up her kit. "And I'll make some calls. I have contacts in horse rescue organizations who might be able to help." "Thank you," Michael said, walking her to her truck for everything. Sarah paused, her expression serious. "Michael, be careful. Blackwood's not just after this horse. He wants the entire Eagle Valley herd gone. They represent the last truly wild Mustangs in this region, and they're on land. He wants for his next development project, a development project in Eagle Valley. That's protected land. Protected for now, but designations can change with enough political pressure and the right incentives. The Mustangs are the main obstacle. As a native species, they have certain protections that make development difficult." The pieces fell into place in Michael's mind, so his crusade against the dangerous Mustangs is about clearing the way for luxury homes and golf courses. Sarah confirmed. Tempest is just a convenience symbol, a way to turn public opinion against all wild horses. If one attacked his son, people can believe they're all dangerous. As Sarah drove away, Michael remained in the yard, absorbing this new information. The situation was bigger than he'd realized, not just about one horse, but an entire threatened ecosystem, a way of life being pushed aside for profit inside the barn. Ellie sat cross-legged outside Tempest's stall, talking to the stallion as if he understood every word. Perhaps he did in his way. The Mustang's eyes were fixed on her face. Heiss expression, almost contemplative. "Dad," Ellie said, looking up as Michael approached. "Tempest needs to go home eventually, back to his family." "His herd," Michael corrected gently. "But first, we have to make sure Mr. Blackwood can't hurt them, any of them." Michael sat beside his daughter, feeling the weight of the challenge ahead. That won't be easy. Kiddo Blackwood has money, influence. People listen to him, they'll listen to the truth too. Ellie insisted. "If we can show them what he did to Tempest, if we can prove he's lying about the Mustangs being dangerous, it's not that simple." "Yes, it is." Ellie's expression was earnest, her belief absolute. "Mom always said that doing the right thing is simple, it's just not always easy." The echo of Rebecca's words hit Michael like a physical blow. His late wife had lived by that principle, simple moral clarity paired with the courage to act on it. No matter the difficulty it was, what had made her an extraordinary nurse, beloved in the community and deeply missed after the car accident that took her life. Tempest nickered softly, drawing Michael's attention back to the present. The stallion had moved closer to the stall door, his magnificent head extended toward them. Despite his injuries, despite all he had suffered, there was a dignity in his bearing, a wild spirit that captivity and cruelty had failed to break. "You're right," Michael told his daughter, a decision crystallizing in his mind. "Your mom was right. Sometimes the simplest answer is the correct one. So we're going to help Tempest and his family." Michael nodded, reaching out to gently touch the Mustang's nose. "Yes, whatever it takes." What Michael couldn't tell his daughter was just how complicated that simple moral choice would become, or how dangerous, because Thomas Blackwood wasn't a man who accepted defeat, and the stakes of this conflict were higher than one horse's life or even an entire herd. They struck at the heart of power, greed, and the question of what and who truly belonged in the wild places of the world. And standing against that power was a wounded veteran, a determined child, and a Mustang, whose spirit remained untamed, despite humanity's cruelest efforts to break it. Morning sunlight streamed through the barn doors as Michael documented Tempest's injuries, carefully photographing each raw mark left by the chains. The stallion stood patiently, seeming to understand the importance of the process, only occasionally shifting his weight when Michael touched a particularly tender spot. "I know, boy," Michael murmured gently, examining a deep gash on the horse's flank. "We're almost done." Ellie had already left for school, reluctantly, after extracting multiple promises from her father that he wouldn't let anything happen to Tempest while she was gone. The fierce protectiveness in her young face had reminded Michael painfully of Rebecca. His late wife had possessed the same unwavering moral certainty, the same willingness to stand against any injustice, no matter how daunting the opposition. Ding sound of tires on gravel interrupted his thoughts. Michael tensed, moving to the barn door to peer out. Relief washed through him at the sight of Sarah Reynolds' truck pulling into the yard, followed by an unfamiliar SUV with Kentucky plates. Frank, Michael breathed, hardly believing his friend had arrived. So quickly, Frank Thompson emerged from the SUV, his powerful frame unfolding, with the careful movements of a man accustomed to managing chronic pain. Like Michael, he carried visible and invisible wounds from their military service, slight limp, a certain weariness in his eyes that never fully disappeared behind him. A woman exited the passenger side, slim and professional in appearance, carrying a camera with a long lens. "Told you'd be here," Frank called, embracing Michael with a firm clasp. Drove straight through. "This is Diane Foster, journalist with the Western Conservation Press. She's written extensively about wild horse management issues." The woman shook Michael's hand, her grip firm. "Dr. Reynolds called me, said you had evidence of animal cruelty connected to Thomas Blackwood." Her gaze was direct, assessing. "I've been investigating Blackwood's development plans for months. If we can link him to illegal activities, it could change everything." Sarah joined them, carrying her medical kit. "I brought more antibiotics and some special wound dressing. How is he this morning?" Michael led them into the barn, where Tempest watched the newcomers with alert caution. The stallion's ears flicked forward at the sight of Sarah, recognizing her from the previous day, but his posture tensed at the unfamiliar faces. "My God," Frank whispered. Approaching slowly, his experienced eye took in the Mustang's condition, the healing wounds, the still visible marks from the chains. "What kind of monster does this to an animal?" Diane was already taking photographs, her camera clicking rapidly. "These injuries are consistent with prolonged restraint and abuse, not just a recent incident." She observed. "How long do you think this was going on before you found him, based on the varying stages of healing?" "I'd say several weeks," Sarah replied, setting down her kit and beginning her examination of Tempest. "Some of these wounds have partially healed, then reopened, suggesting he was restrained for an extended period, probably moved multiple times before ending up on that cliff." "Blackwood waste experimenting," Frank suggested grimly, "testing how much abuse the horse could take or making him suffer deliberately," Michael added. The thought turning his stomach, punishing him for what happened to Jason. Deanne lowered her camera, her expression intent. "Tell me everything from the beginning. I need all the details if we're going to build a case against Blackwood." Michael recounted the events on Thunder Mountain, finding Tempest chained to the cliff, Blackwood's appearance and threats, the dangerous rescue and escape through the storm. He showed them the chains and restraints he'd removed still stained with the stallion's blood. "And Sheriff Miller knows about this?" Diane asked. Making notes, he saw Tempest last night claimed officially he didn't, but he knows Miller's in a difficult position. Sarah explained Blackwood practically funded his last campaign, but Dave's a decent man at heart. He won't actively help us, but he might look the other way long enough for us to gather evidence. Frank had been examining the restraints, his expression darkening. These aren't standard horse restraints, they're custom-made, designed to cause maximum discomfort. Whoever created these knew exactly what they were doing. "Can we prove Blackwood ordered them?" Diane asked. "If we can track the manufacturer," Frank replied. "Custom metal work like this isn't common. There can't be many sources in the area," as they discussed strategy. Tempest remained calm, his intelligent eyes moving from one human to another as if following the conversation. The stallion's resilience amazed Michael. After all he'd suffered at human hands, he still allowed them to approach, to touch his wounds, to help him. "Health heirs more," Michael said, explaining what Sarah had told him about Blackwood's development plans for Eagle Valley. "This isn't just about revenge for his son. It's about removing the Mustangs as an obstacle to his new resort project." Diane nodded in surprise. "I've been tracking Blackwood's land acquisitions. Around Eagle Valley for months he's bought everything he can. But the Central Valley is federally protected land designated as wild horse territory. The only way he can get his hands on it is if the designation is changed, and the easiest way to do that is to prove the Mustangs are dangerous, a public threat." Frank concluded exactly. If he can convince the Bureau of Land Management that the herd poses a safety risk, they could authorize an emergency roundup. Once the horses are gone, the land's protected status becomes much easier to challenge. Sarah looked up. "From treating Tempest's wounds, that's why he focused on this particular stallion. Tempest is the lead stallion of the Eagle Valley herd. Take him out, and the herd structure is weakened, making them more vulnerable." "How do you know he's the lead stallion?" Michael asked, surprised. "I've been observing the Eagle Valley herd for years, documenting their behavior patterns. This one," she nodded toward Tempest, "took over leadership about 2 years ago. He's unusually intelligent even for a Mustang. The white blaze makes him easy to identify." The pieces continued to fall into place in Michael's mind. So Blackwood took out the leader, thinking the rest of the herd would be easier to manipulate, and he used his son's accident as cover for a vendetta that's really about development rights. It fits his pattern. Diane confirmed. In Nevada, he used water rights disputes to force ranchers to sell. In Montana, it was suddenly enforced zoning regulations that coincidentally only affected properties he wanted. Blackwood creates a crisis, offers himself as the solution, and walks away with exactly what he wanted. All along, the barn door creaked. Suddenly, and they all turned to see Sheriff Dave Miller standing in the entrance, his expression grim. "Cooper," he acknowledged with a nod. "We need to talk," Sheriff Michael said cautiously, moving to place himself between Miller and Tempest. "This isn't what it looks like." Miller's mouth twitched. "It looks like you're harboring an injured wild horse and plotting against the most powerful man in the county. Seems pretty accurate to me." Frank stepped forward, his stance protective. "The horse was being abused. We have documentation." "I'm sure you do." Miller sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "And ordinarily I'd say that's a matter for animal control in the courts, but nothing about this situation is ordinary." "What's happened?" Sarah asked, reading something in the sheriff's face that the others had missed. "Ul Woods filed formal charges against you, Michael. Theft, trespassing, destruction of private property, reckless endangerment. He claims you stole his horse and damaged expensive equipment in the process." "That's absurd," Michael protested. "Tempest, a wild Mustang, not his property, and those chains were instruments of torture. He has paperwork saying otherwise." Miller replied, "Claims he had legitimate capture permits from the BLM for nuisance animal removal. Says the restraints were standard protocol for a dangerous animal. And you believe that?" Frank challenged. Miller's gaze hardened. "What I believe doesn't matter. I enforce the law as written." But sometimes he glanced meaningfully at Tempest. "The law needs help catching up to what's right." "What are you saying, Dave?" Michael asked. "I'm saying I have a warrant for your arrest that I'm choosing not to execute right now. I'm saying Blackwood's men are combing this county for that horse, and when they find him, which they will eventually, they'll have legal authority to take him, so you're warning us. Sarah realized Miller replaced his hat, carefully. I'm doing my job by informing you of the legal situation. What you do with that information is up to you. He turned to go. Then paused in the doorway. Blackwood's holding a town hall. Meeting tonight at the community center, making his case about the wild horse menace too. The public might be educational to attend, after the sheriff left. A heavy silence fell over the barn, broken only by Tempest's soft nickering. He's giving us time, Frank said finally. Not much, but some time for what? Michael asked. If Blackwood has legal permits obtained under false pretenses. Diane interrupted. If we can prove Blackwood lied about the horse attacking his son. If we can document the abuse, we can challenge the legality of those permits. Sarah nodded, finishing her treatment of Tempest's wounds. The town meeting might be our best opportunity. Get people to see the truth before Blackwood can control the narrative completely. How Michael demanded we can't exactly bring Tempest to the community center. Frank and Diane exchanged a meaningful, look, maybe we don't have to, Frank. They said, Diane, those photos you took, can you have them printed by this evening? Easily. And I have video documentation of similar cases, where horses were illegally removed from protected land if we can present a compelling case to the community. We'd be putting a target on our backs. Michael warned Blackwood won't take public opposition lightly. You already have a target on your back, Frank pointed out. At least this way, you won't face him alone. As they continued, planning their approach for the town meeting. Michael's phone rang. The school's number flashed on the screen, sending a spike of worry through him. Hello. He answered tensely. Mr. Cooper, this is Principal Walters. There's been an incident involving Ellie. She's not hurt, the administrator added quickly, but we need you to come to the school right away. What the kind of incident? Michael asked, already moving toward the door, a hesitation on the line. It involves Jason Blackwood. He was visiting the school. Toe talked to the children about horse safety, and Ellie, well, she publicly accused him of lying. Things escalated from there. Michael closed his eyes briefly. Of course, Ellie wouldn't stay silent when confronted with Jason Blackwood spreading falsehoods about wild horses. Your mother's daughter through and through. I'll be right there, he promised, ending the call problem. Frank asked, noting Michael's expression. Ellie confronted Jason Blackwood at school. I need to go deal with this, Frank. Nodded. Go, Will. Continue working on the plan for tonight, and Michael, he added as his friend headed for the door, remember, you're not alone in this fight anymore. The elementary school parking lot was conspicuously empty, except for a sleek black Lexus that Michael recognized as belonging to the Blackwood family inside the building. The hallways were quiet, classes in session behind closed doors. Principal Walters, a nervous man with perpetually ink-stained fingers, waited outside his office. Mr. Cooper, thank you for coming so quickly, he said, fidgeting with his tie. This is a rather delicate situation. Where's my daughter? Inside with Mr. Blackwood and his son. I should warn you. Michael didn't wait for the warning, pushing past the principal into the office there. He found Ellie small but defiant in a chair much too large for her, facing Thomas Blackwood, and a young man with his arm in a cast who could only be Jason. Her teacher stood nervously to one side, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. Dad? Ellie jumped up, relief washing over her face. Are you okay? Michael asked, checking her for any sign of harm. I'm fine, I just told the truth. And they got mad. Thomas Blackwood rose slowly, his expensive suit immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled in the fluorescent office lighting. His features seemed harder, more predatory than they had on the mountain. Cooper, he acknowledged coldly. Your daughter disrupted an educational presentation and publicly slandered my son. I trust you'll address her behavior appropriately. Michael placed a protective hand on Ellie's shoulder. What exactly did she say? Jason, a pale echo of his father with weaker features and restless eyes, spoke up. The little brat called me a liar. In front of the whole fourth grade, said I tormented wild horses for fun and deserved what happened to me. Did you say that, Michael asked Ellie quietly. His daughter lifted her chin, unrepentant. I said he wasn't telling the truth about the Mustangs being dangerous, that they only attacked him because he was chasing them on ATVs, and that what his father did to Tempest was cruel and wrong. Michael felt a chill in defending the Mustang. Ellie had revealed that Tempest was at their ranch information. Blackwood might not have known. For certain until now, children often repeat stories they've heard without understanding the implications, Blackwood said smoothly. I'm sure Ellie doesn't realize how serious these accusations are or the trouble they could cause for you, Cooper. The threat was thinly veiled. But Principal Walters seemed oblivious to the subtext. We take disruptive behavior very seriously at our school, he said. However, given Ellie's usually exemplary conduct, I believe a formal apology would resolve this matter. Apologize? Ellie looked horrified. But I didn't, Ellie. Michael interrupted, gently kneeling to her level. Sometimes we need to choose our battles and our timing carefully. He met her eyes, trying to communicate silently that this wasn't surrender, merely strategic retreat. His daughter was perceptive beyond her ears. After a moment, she nodded, slightly understanding. I'm sorry for disrupting your presentation, she said to Jason, her voice carefully controlled, and for speaking out of turn. The deliberate omission of any apology for her actual claims wasn't lost on Blackwood, whose eyes narrowed fractionally. Children, he said with a cold smile, so passionate, so unfiltered. Perhaps she gets that from her mother. The mention of Rebecca, the implied criticism of her memory, sent a flash of anger through Michael. He rose slowly, meeting Blackwood's gaze directly. My daughter has her mother's integrity and courage, yes, he said evenly. Rebecca would be proud of her standing up for what's right, even when it puts her family at risk. Blackwood asked, his voice dropping, to ensure only Michael could hear. A child without a mother is tragic. A child without either parent would be devastating. Before Michael could respond to the thinly veiled threat, Principal Walters cleared his throat anxiously. Well, if we've resolved the immediate issue, perhaps Ellie can return to class. Actually, I'll be taking my daughter home for the day. Michael decided, not willing to leave Ellie at school where Blackwood or his son might have further access to her. As you wish, Blackwood said pleasantly. Jason and I were just finishing our visit anyway. We have preparations to make for tonight's town meeting. He straightened his already impeccable suit. I do hope you'll attend, Cooper. It should be quite educational. As they left the school, Ellie looked up at her father. I'm not really sorry, Dad. He was telling lies about the Mustangs, making them sound dangerous and mean. Michael helped her into the truck. I know, kiddo, and standing up for the truth is important, but sometimes we need to be strategic about how and when we fight our battles, like tonight at the meeting. Michael nodded, impressed by her perception. Exactly like that. We're going to show everyone the truth about Tempest and what Blackwood did to him. Ellie's face lit up, and then they'll help us protect him. The other Mustangs. I hope so, Michael said, wishing he could share his daughter's certainty. I really hope so. But as they drove home, the weight of Blackwood's threat hung heavy in his thoughts. The developer hadn't just threatened Michael's freedom or reputation, he had threatened Ellie's safety, her future. The stakes had been raised, the line between right and wrong blurred by the reality of power and vulnerability. What had started as a simple act of compassion on Thunder Mountain had escalated into a dangerous confrontation with a man who wielded his wealth and influence like weapons. Michael had faced enemies in war, had stared down death in foreign deserts, but this battle on home soil with his daughter's well-being in the balance terrified him in ways combat never had, and waiting at home was a wounded Mustang whose fate was intertwined with theirs, a wild spirit who had somehow come to represent everything worth fighting for, everything worth protecting, no matter the cost. Evening shadows stretched across Horizon Ridge as people filtered into the community center for the town meeting. The modest building, once the town schoolhouse before the new elementary was built, was filling rapidly, unusual for a community that typically showed little interest in local politics. Michael stood at the back, scanning the crowd. Familiar faces filled the rows of folding chairs. Neighbors, shopkeepers, ranchers from outlying properties, all people whose livelihoods were connected directly or indirectly to the prosperity that Thomas Blackwood had promised would flow from his development projects. Bigger turnout than the Christmas pageant, Frank observed beside him, his voice low. Blackwood's got them. Curious or worried? Michael replied, noting the tension evident in many faces. People don't like choosing sides. Ellie stood on Michael's, though the side refusing to sit when there was so much at stake. She clutched a folder containing printed photos of Tempest's injuries, documentation she had insisted on carrying herself. Sarah Reynolds had taken Ellie home earlier to check on Tempest while Michael and Frank prepared for the meeting, and the veterinarian was now making her way toward them through the crowd. "He's comfortable," Sarah reported quietly. "I gave him another dose of antibiotics and made sure he had fresh water and hay. Maria Gonzalez is keeping watch at your place." Michael nodded gratefully. Maria, a neighboring rancher whose property bordered his, had been one of the few people in town willing to openly befriend him after Rebecca's death. Her support now, when so much was at risk, meant more than he could express. "Blackwood's here," Frank murmured, nodding toward the front of the room where Thomas Blackwood had entered through a side door, accompanied by Jason and several men in expensive suits, lawyers probably, or business associates. Mayor Harold Wilson, a round man with a perpetual sheen of nervous sweat, hurried to greet Blackwood with an obsequious handshake. The two men conferred briefly before the mayor moved to the small podium at the front.